everyone. Welcome to Occupational Therapy 245, Intro to Research Methodology. Today's topic is Qualitative Research Designs, and my name is Melissa Kay. Let's get started. We have three objectives for today. First of all, we're going to go into describing basic qualitative design characteristics. Then we're going to define some key terms that are related to qualitative studies. And finally, we'll explain the key factors that are involved in various types of qualitative studies. So we covered quantitative design, and now we're taking a look at qualitative design. All right, so qualitative research, really different than quantitative research. It's based on identifying a phenomenon, which could be a process, it could be a concept. It's centered on a research question, which is often pretty open-ended in nature. So we don't know what's going to happen, and it's oftentimes also more exploratory. Information's collected, and then the researcher interacts with the information and then sometimes comes up with more questions, sometimes digs some more, sometimes decides, okay, I have enough information. So quantitative research, right, is centered on explaining or predicting how variables go together and how the independent variable affects the dependent variable, right? With qualitative research, there's not this focus on numerical results and statistical analysis using a statistical software program. Rather, we're looking at the quality, thus qualitative research, of what we find. So we're going to dig into that. I know it sounds hopelessly kind of vague and like, what? How do you pin that down? So I have a lot of examples for you. We're going to be looking at articles, and hopefully this lecture will fill in some of those blanks. First off, I wanted to show you a comparison between naturalistic and experimental. So naturalistic is qualitative and experimental is quantitative. And you can pause the recording or look at the slide deck, and I do recommend that you download the slide deck so that you can access the presenter notes. We're not going to go through all of this, but it gives you some language and some ideas about the ways in which these two different types of inquiry vary. Just one example at the bottom, right? The investigator, that means the researcher. With qualitative research, the investigator is very involved, right? So they actually are conducting the interviews. They may go in, if you think about like anthropology or sociology, they may actually go and live with the people that they're studying. So they're very involved, as opposed to experimental research, which is quantitative, where we are really placing a high value on the investigator not being involved and being quote unquote objective, right? So very different views, and you can look through this and get an idea of some of the ways that the two types of research designs vary. So what is qualitative research? Well, qualitative researchers are interested in understanding how people interpret or make sense of their experiences, how they construct their worlds, so another word for that is worldview, and what meaning they attribute to their experiences. This has to do with culture, it has to do with society, it has to do with community, family, the individual. It also has to do with what if somebody experiences an illness or has a health condition or a disabling condition, right? So OTs look at it to get at kind of that meat of how is the person experiencing their life and their everyday occupations, and what is the effect potentially of disabling conditions on those occupations. There's some goals of qualitative inquiry. The first one is to foster deeper understanding. So, what that basically means is we might have an idea about how somebody, the beliefs that a person has in the world, and we really want to dig in and check it out and see, is that really what's going on? What else might be going on for that person? Also, we're exploring participants' views, perspectives, and experiences. So contrast that with quantitative inquiry, where we are looking at behaviors, right, and abilities. The purpose of qualitative research is to make some meaning out of what we see or out of phenomenon or processes. Also to increase our understanding of the client, and that is always important because the more we understand our clients, the more effectively we can treat them. It also helps us to understand a variety of different kinds of phenomena. It helps us to develop theory, right? So with quantitative research, we're trying to prove or illustrate examples of a theory that exists. With qualitative research, we're actually developing theory potentially. And it's useful for research questions that aren't easily measured. So, we sometimes combine quantitative and qualitative, and we call it a mixed method study. And it enables us to get at kind of the nuts and bolts of a situation, as well as some questions that may not be really easy to measure. Characteristics, and please check out your presenter notes for more on all of these. So qualitative research is naturalistic, meaning that it is in a natural setting as opposed to a lab. It's holistic, so it takes into account everything about a person or a phenomenon rather than one tiny slice, right? So in your lit reviews this semester, you're narrowing your topic down, right, to something that's super manageable in size and finite and discrete. With qualitative inquiry, we're kind of broadening out what we're thinking about and letting it go more holistic. Dynamic systems. So that is the idea that that there's not any straightforward, easy answers to anything, because within a system, there's a lot of moving parts, right? And if we have like parts A through M, if part A moves, then it causes part B to move, which changes the relationship between B and C or B and M. So it's looking at how things move in relationship to each other and how things change in relationship to each other. It's often based on a case study or a small number of folks who are participating in the research. Another difference between quantitative and qualitative, right? And it's sensitive to the context. In other words, it's sensitive to differences in people's values and beliefs, the environment that they live in, their cultural behaviors, and so as a result, it doesn't give us like a conclusion about anybody, but it gives us more depth of information. This next term, empathic neutrality, means that, so empathy means I understand and can kind of feel what you feel, right, without taking it on. And the neutrality part means that I don't want to insert myself into your life, if you're the research participant, and affect how you behave. But I want you to know that here I am and I'm being empathetic to you. So empathic neutrality has to do with this idea of being non-judgmental, but also understanding that it's really impossible to be 100% neutral or objective in a situation. And then the final term or characteristic is design flexibility. So topics can come up and evolve, And within qualitative research, we may tweak how we're addressing the research questions and how we're addressing collecting data based on what we found. You'll often hear it called an iterative process, which basically means that as we go along, we change things to meet the demands of the status quo and what's going on. So, unlike quantitative research, where we choose a methodology and then we stick to that methodology, and we also often choose statistical tests before we've even conducted the data collection, we also will choose the level of significance before we start data collection. So in contrast with that, in qualitative research, there's a lot more flexibility. The researcher as instrument. So what does that mean? So the researcher, of course, collects the data and analyzes the data, but they also do something called attend to reflexivity. So that's about acknowledging again that the researcher has a role within the research. As a qualitative research, I become part of the research process, and my experiences, my assumptions, my beliefs about the world and who I am will influence the research process. And so we acknowledge that, but we also engage in this process of reflexivity, which means that I actually examine my own beliefs, values, assumptions, experiences, and see, am I laying my own experience on top of these other people's experiences, or am I able to realize who I am in the world and then set that aside while I'm conducting research? So we confront our assumptions and biases when we conduct qualitative research. It actually, when I was a master's student, which was post-professional at San Jose State, I did a phenomenological study, and we'll dig into phenomenology just a little bit. But I had some preconceived notions about who my participants were. They were actually kids that were in my practice who had sensory processing and sensory integration challenges. And so what I had to do is think to myself, what am I assuming about all these kids? And then set that aside so that I could keep an open enough mind to actually understand and collect data that apply to the kids rather than my impression of the kids. All right. I feel like there's like a ton of words, and the words are all sort of like this, right? So quantitative research is like the mean, the mode, the median, and this is like reflexivity. So if you're feeling like that, that's totally cool. We're going to be going through stuff throughout the semester and looking at various different kinds of studies. So we'll have more experience with figuring out how this works. All right, reflexivity. I acknowledge my role in the research, and I just talked about that. Thick description, which is a funny term, right, is a way of achieving a type of external validity. So think about it. In qualitative research, it's going to be really hard to generalize to a population because we're only studying a teeny number of people. But by describing a phenomenon in sufficient detail, so that's the thick part, right? So lots of detail, lots of input, lots of gathering of data. The idea is that the researcher can begin to evaluate the extent to which conclusions drawn are transferable, in other words, generalizable, to other times, settings, situations, or people. So this thick description is a way of increasing the rigor of qualitative research. Inductive, and this applies to reasoning, inductive reasoning. So let's start with deductive, right, which goes with quantitative research. Deductive reasoning works from a more general place to a very specific place. It's kind of a top-down approach. We start thinking up a theory about our topic, then we narrow it down to a specific hypothesis that we can test, and then we narrow it down even further when we collect observations to address the hypothesis, right? So it leads us to be able to confirm or not confirm our original theory. Okay, so that's deductive, but we're talking about inductive in qualitative research. So inductive works the total opposite way. We move from very specific observations about people, right? So we're interviewing them, we're observing them, we're collecting their artifacts, we're looking at them very specifically, and then we gradually spread out and make broader generalizations and potentially start to develop theories about what's going on. We sometimes call this a bottom-up approach. And in inductive reasoning, we start off with very specific observations and measures. We start looking for patterns and regularities or irregularities. We formulate some tentative hypotheses. And finally, we come up with some more general conclusions or theories. These are really different, and they have a very different feel to them. And we will talk more about that. And then the final term is critical research or critical theory. So the purpose of critical analysis, and you'll hear it called a bunch of different things, but look for the critical part of it, right? The purpose of it is to expose and challenge taken for granted power structures and to offer alternative perspectives to knowledge, theory building, and social reality. So critical analysis is gaining more importance in the scientific and academic communities because it's interdisciplinary and it's actually challenging. It's very political at heart, right? And it's challenging the status quo. So it's a super interesting area of research. All right. So I like this this illustration, and I just wanted to give it to you because maybe it will help. So if you look, you have the sea, right? And the boat's on the surface of the sea. And then we have this little island. You might think of it as an iceberg. And there's things going on the top, right? And that is what we can see. When we do qualitative research, what our goal is to dive down and see what all those things and all those behaviors and beliefs and ways of being in the world and culturally mediated behaviors and roles. It's to dive down and look at all that stuff that's not immediately apparent, right? So it's a way, just kind of one visual of a way to look at qualitative research and what that process is about. So, wow. Another diving analogy. We deep dive into experiences. We look at the person within their environment instead of plucking them out and sticking them in a lab, right? And the benefits of a lab are many. We can control for variables that we don't want to measure that might confound or muddy our research. But in qualitative research, we want to look at the person within their environment and within their family, community, and culture. Goal, again, thick description. An inductive approach moves from specific to broader understandings. So we're kind of going through this again, and that's on purpose so that you have a couple passes with some of these potentially less familiar terms. Some of you may have already really dug into qualitative research. So if you're already familiar, go ahead and fast forward. All right, and data collection and analysis may happen at the same time. Who knew? And again, that's that iterative process, right? So we're collecting data and we're analyzing it, and then we're moving from our newfound understandings. We have a lot of different sources of data. The researcher generates it. It can be naturally occurring. So observation of a person. It exists regardless of the presence of the researcher. So what's happening in that person's life is going to go on whether or not we're there, right? We're just there capturing it. And an example of this is an observation of a classroom conversation, right? So if we're a fly on the wall, that conversation is going to happen whether or not we're a fly on the wall or not. We're capturing it rather than creating it. And common data sources are interviews, observations, and documents that people have created. So a snapshot of qualitative research. There's no starting hypothesis because our whole goal is to think about, what's going on, right? There's few participants, a natural context, the researcher is involved to some extent, and there's interpretive analysis. So I have a sneeze in my nose. Hopefully it'll go away. Otherwise it'll come out. Okay. So rather than deducing what's going on from hard, cold facts that we get in quantitative data analysis, we're interpreting what we saw to the best of our ability in qualitative. So again, a very different kind of approach. And one of your readings is Crafting 1991. I know that's old, but she actually really captured how can we dig in and do all this stuff without it being totally woo-woo and like, why would we do that, right? So how can we analyze data in qualitative research in a meaningful and trustworthy way? So definitely check that out. Okay, and that brings us to rigor in qualitative research. So here is an elephant in a living room, right? And you've maybe heard that term before. What's the elephant in the living room? Well, the elephant in the living room is the criticism of qualitative research as being not thorough, not useful, not powerful, not rigorous, right? And some institutions place more value or less on it. Some journals place more or less value on qualitative research. When I was getting my doctorate, it was a very quantitatively oriented school and department. And we could do qualitative research, but really the focus was on quantitative. And so people have a lot of preconceived notions about it. It's not as easy as 7 out of 10 dentists recommend X toothpaste, right? So we're not able to just like pin something down and say, here it is. What I would say to you, and this is not in defense of qualitative research, but what I would say to you is that within quantitative research, right, so the 7 out of 10 dentists, there's always going to be some subjectivity. There's always going to be variables that skew the data. There's going to be financial investors that have a stake in how research comes out, right? So there's a whole school of things that can affect what we think or what we would like to believe is 100% objective. And we can certainly revisit this when we meet in person. It's a very interesting topic. And qualitative research can get a bad rap. We're going to look at both because doing qualitative research within the field of occupational therapy is super useful. So, criticisms and concerns, I've gone over some of them. It's not rigorous enough. It's opinion-based, low validity and reliability, sloppy data collection and analysis. In other words, if you can just change it whenever you want, how can that be like academic and rigorous, right? Lacks reproducibility. And so if I do it and then qualitative researcher C does it, we can't produce the same study because it's small and we're bringing ourselves into it and we're bringing individuals rather than samples that represent a population. Also, of course, it lacks generalizability. So I can't say that my 16 participants who I interviewed for 4 hours represent the population of people with any particular quality. So those are the concerns and criticisms. We do, however, have a number of strategies for increasing rigor and trustworthiness. And trustworthiness is the qualitative term for like validity, reliability, all that stuff. So some of this has to do with how we decide to sample, how much data we collect, so that idea of thick description, and also data saturation. So you go till you've gotten enough data that you start seeing patterns, and you see the same patterns over and over, and you're not getting anything new. Also, ethics and design, so being ethical. Member checking, going back to the people and saying, this is what I heard you say. Is this what you meant, right? And persistent and prolonged engagement. So the longer we spend with our research participants, the more trustworthy the data is going to be. If we go and hang out with them for half an hour, they might not be feeling well, or they might be having a particularly great day, and tomorrow they're going to be back to their status quo. We just don't know. So this prolonged engagement is important. And then triangulation of data sources. And I think I covered triangulation on the next slide. So let's press on. Yes. Okay. So it's the use of multiple strategies or methods of collecting and analyzing data to strengthen the credibility of findings about the phenomenon under study. So using a bunch of different methods to get and analyze the data is going to help us with the amount of rigor or trustworthiness. And triangulation can happen like we do observations and interviews and review documents. It could be that we find themes and we corroborate them across multiple participants. It could be that there's multiple researchers and we all collaborate to see, did we see a similar pattern? And then it's, data triangulation as well as a piece where we look at these different data sources, right? And we see, are they saying the same thing? Are they saying different things? So a lot of different types of triangulation. All right. It's your cute goat picture. It's time for you to take a break. Please get up, stop your video, note where you were, stretch, get a drink of water, shake it off. I know this is dense information, and I'll see you back here in a little bit. Okay, for those of you that didn't walk away, really walk away just for a minute. And for those of you that did, welcome back. We're going to continue with part 2. Qualitative designs. So this is a list of the various different qualitative designs that you might see, and we're going to go through them one at a time. Okay, so for each of the different kinds of qualitative designs, I have given you a different color slide background. This one is royal blue, and the first slide will be about the type of research. The second slide will be an example. So if you want to look it up and see what is this, how does it work, how do they do this, you have somewhere to go with that. So it's for your, it's for you to dig into as much or as little as you feel is necessary. All right, so participatory action research, or PAR. The goal is to get knowledge and then act on that knowledge. And it's pretty cool because it's a team of researchers and participants who are working together. So very far from, the researcher as expert. It's critical research. And again, remember I said that critical research is questioning the status quo on many different levels of kind of political, societal, cultural realities. We have theory involved in it, and we also have action. So kind of two different phases. And the principles are democracy, equity, liberation, and life enhancement. So some pretty cool stuff, right? It's got a very occupational justice kind of perspective. And basically, we involve the people who are participants in the research as agents of change or researchers themselves. So they're looking at their own selves, and we're helping them with that, with the idea of changing. Really interesting. So here's a study by Blakeney and Marshall, and you can feel free to look at the summary of it in the presenter notes section of each of the slides, or to actually look up the article if you're interested. All right, so critical research. We've heard that term before, and we know that participatory action research is a type of critical research. But this is like a little bit more pure, right? So the goal is to critique, challenge, transform, and empower. And, so this word critical is actually really apt because we're not accepting what is. Our goal is that we identify something that's inequitable or unethical or just doesn't seem to be working. Social disparities of health is a really big area of this for OTs. And then we're kind of pulling out the truth from that. So we're deconstructing the idea that there's one universal truth. We're taking the idea that that me, with all my demographics, are different potentially from you, with your background, your culture, your demographics, your socioeconomic status, your family structure, all of that. And so within quantitative data, our whole goal is to say, oh, all of these people are alike, and so we can draw these conclusions from them. With critical research, what we're saying is, oh, people are very, very different, and there isn't one truth about all people within a particular population. A study for you, and a summary. All right, phenomenology. So this is the type of study that I did. So I have probably the most experience with this, although I've done some other kinds of qualitative research as well. And the goal is to increase one's understanding of lived experiences. The primary data gathering tool is an interview, and it's a very open-ended process where we use a question about how, why, or what, right? So we're looking at figuring out or focusing on describing people's lived experience. Within the approach, we need to do something called bracketing. And what bracketing means is that we identify our own biases and we then very purposefully and consciously set them aside so that we're not influenced by them. Anne McCrae, who was a professor at San Jose State for many years. She was one of my professors and mentors, both undergrad and graduate. And then, I was colleague, and she mentored me and actually got me my first job teaching in the online master's program at San Jose State. Anyways, we go really way back, and she is just the dearest, most brilliant person ever. She passed away in 2021 in July, and it was a huge loss. But anyway, so a couple articles by her, and what she looked at is folks with mental health issues, in particular schizophrenia, and the phenomenon, if you will, of hallucinations. So really interesting. Whoever asks anybody with schizophrenia what their experience of hallucinations is, without beyond the goal of figuring out what kind of medication could tamp them down. But she dug into this phenomenon of hallucinations. All right, next up, ethnography. Okay, so the goal is to understand the beliefs, rituals, patterns, and institutions that define a culture. So here we're really associating this type of qualitative design with anthropology. And you can probably imagine that. You go into a very remote part of the world and study a tribe there, for example. I spend a lot of time on Kauai, and in the 50s and 60s, researchers came and did a longitudinal study, and I don't know if it was an ethnography, but they came and they spent a lot of time on Kauai, and part of the reason they chose this island was that it was very remote and the population was very insular, right? So they weren't affected by a lot of other things coming in. But anyways, I digress. Sorry. So data collection. You observe, interview, examine artifacts. And artifacts are anything that exists for the group of people. It could be, what kind of knives do they use? It could be what sort of stereo systems do they have? It could be whatever it is, right? It could also be documents. It could be technology. It could be clothing, a range of things. So any things can be artifacts. And again, here's this term of thick description, which then again means that we spend a long time with a group of people until we really gather so much data that we start to see patterns in the data, and we understand that we have data saturation and we are seeing the same things over and over again rather than having new parts of a phenomenon present themselves. Sample study. Next up, narrative inquiry, and we're in the home stretch here. The goal of narrative inquiry is to emphasize the voices and experiences of marginalized, vulnerable, or excluded people. It provides descriptions and meanings of experience, and it is very popular in postmodern qualitative research circles. And the narrative piece is about people making meaning of their lives through their own stories. And the idea that language is both powerful and dynamic. So it's not just talking, right? How people say what they mean, how they choose to say it, what words they use, what they bring into their language and into their narrative is all important. And there was this kind of cool quote. The oldest and most natural form of sense making are stories or narratives, right? So we've been telling stories for millennia. And so this method of research is storytelling and making sense of the world through narrative or story. Here's a study that explores that. And then life history, next up in green. The goal is to reveal the nature of an individual's life process and experiences over time. It can be a standalone method or combined with other approaches. It uses a single individual or a few people, because it takes some time to get a life history, right? And the aim of inquiry is revealed through a historical examination. So we look back on a person's life. So could you imagine, an older adult or an extremely older adult telling you their life story? Maybe you have grandparents who have done this, and how much we can learn about the person and their life and process and experience, but also about the world through the history of the person. So pretty cool method. Examples. Next up, grounded theory. So the goal is to, and note theory in the name, the goal is to evolve a theory about a phenomenon under consideration. It integrates quantitative and qualitative perspectives, so that's pretty interesting. It's a little bit more structured in terms of the data gathering, and it's constantly comparing during data analysis. how is this and how is this? How do they compare with each other? How do they relate to each other? How are they different than each other? And so the idea is that we develop a theory that's grounded in what we saw or observed or heard through interviews or documents. Let's see. This is not a term that you need to take with you, but it's an interesting term. It's called abductive thinking. So in addition to inductive, now we have this abductive, which means considering multiple possibilities before reaching a deductive conclusion. So kind of interesting. And sampling data, it fills out the properties of an emergent conceptual category. Whew. Very heady. An example of this. All right, so those are our designs. Please do study them and be sure that you understand them. How do we distinguish amongst them? A lot of them sound kind of similar, right? So ways that they may vary include how intensely the investigator is involved, how intensely the research and data collection focuses on an individual's experiences, and the extent to which the investigator imposes a structure on data collection and analysis. So how much are they trying to box things in or just kind of let it flow? So here's an example of one topic and some different types of inquiry. Okay, so we take new OT grad students, which you can relate to. And if we're thinking about grounded theory, we might think about the process of inducting new OT grad students, right? So what kind of theory could arise from our process of inducting or bringing you into our program? If we're thinking about narrative, conversely, we might look at the life stories of new OT grad students, particularly as it relates to choosing OT as a career. So we might go back in history and be like, how did you get here, right? And those stories are super interesting. In fact, you told me some of your stories, some of you, and I absolutely love this assignment in 212 when you did your timelines and look back at your life and your different occupational milestones. So that's an example of a little bit of narrative. It's not, I wasn't doing research, but it's narrative. All right, phenomenology, the experience of being a first-year OT grad student. So I would talk to you about that experience and find out as much as I could about it and talk to a number of you to see how did your experiences differ and how might they be the same. If we were considering ethnography, we might look at the everyday practices and perspectives that are central to becoming an OT practitioner during one's internship. So what makes up that? And finally, if we were doing participatory action research, we might include you as stakeholders. We might also pull in the faculty, the dean, and the provost to discuss, evaluate, and revise the graduate writing assignment requirement or policies, right? So the GWAR. So that may be an example of participatory action research. Hopefully that helped to give a little bit of a flavor to it and to see that we continue to have our participants be OT graduate students, but we can look at things from many different angles. Again, just as with quantitative research, which you choose really depends on what your research questions are. All right. You made it to the end. Congratulations. So next week, we're going to look at evaluating the quality of research, validity and reliability, which again apply to quantitative research, and then trustworthiness, which applies to qualitative research. That's what I got for you today. I'm looking forward to seeing you in class. Please note your questions. Bring them to class. We'll be going over them. And like I said, if this is confusing and feels like like you're trying to grasp onto mercury or something that's just sliding through your hands, give it some time. As we read some articles, you'll get a much better grasp of, oh, that's what they were doing, right? So it's conceptual and heady, and also can be super interesting. So keep an open mind, keep flexible, don't give yourself a hard time, and I will see you in class. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.